So welcome everybody to Maine Historical Society's Historians Forum, Maine and the Nation in 1820. This is our first ever online forum or virtual forum, Zoom Historians Forum, whatever you'd like to call it. So thank you so much for participating today. So I want to introduce our coordinator, our host for the Historians Forum, Ian Saxine, who is a professor at Bridgewater State University. Ian received his PhD from Northwestern University, and he teaches history and the British Atlantic World History at Bridgewater State. His research focuses on colonial and Native American history, especially in New England. And his first book, Properties of Empire, Indians, Colonists, and the Land Speculators on the New England Frontier, was published last year, and he had a wonderful book launch with us at Maine Historical Society. And he is here today to MC, if you will, our Historians Forum. So I'm going to turn it over to Ian and to our speakers.
Thanks so much, Kathleen, for setting everything up. Everything has been going well. For the technical situation here has very much been thanks to Kathleen, and then the glitches have been minor and very, very fixable. I'd also like to point out and thank Jamie Rice, our director of the library. And I don't know if you wanted to say anything at the start of the day, Jamie, or no?
I do. I'd like to welcome everyone to the Historians Forum. And I wanted to take this time to share a few remarks from our organization. And we know MHS is excited to offer quality programming for Maine's bicentennial. I'd like to thank Ian Saxine, our forum coordinator, and each of today's presenters for sharing a wealth of knowledge and their expansive expertise as we explore Maine and the nation in 1820. Fully understanding the role of what is now known as Maine in the national and international narrative and contextualizing that role through diverse perspectives is the underpinning of MHS's bicentennial offerings. But more importantly, we aim to learn how Maine became Maine, and that begins with being honest and reflective about our shared and complex history. MHS in Portland as a physical entity is on Wabanaki homeland, and in a virtual setting, we must further reflect on what this statement really means. As a country, we've been reminded in recent months that forced colonization and systemic racism, treachery, and violence are not a thing of the past, and we must learn from our ancestors' mistakes to recognize that understanding, contextualizing, and learning from history is not the same as erasing it. So as MHS continues to reflect on Maine's and our own institutional history, we appreciate and value the support of the diverse communities in Maine and look forward to a better understanding of the impact of the past on our present realities and explore visions for healing and change in the future. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. It seems like a perfect day for a Historians Forum, at least in Portland, where it's muggy and rainy. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Ian. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much, Jamie. Very much, I'll keep things short. And so thanks to all our presenters for coming. This was really personally exciting and gratifying to me to be able to have the opportunity to speak with so many talented scholars for this forum. Every year, it just seems to keep getting better and better in terms of the qualities of people that we're fortunate enough to get to come to MHS. So really excited and grateful for those people to do so. A final sort of housekeeping note before we get going here. So since we are the first digital version of the annual Historians Forum, that means we are also on Twitter. And so if you are announcing where you're at, or where what we're up to, the hashtag is Maine 1820. And so if you wish to brag to all of your friends about what you're up to and tell them to join, registration is still open. And so the very quick overview of today then. So we're going to be starting with our morning panel, in which we get a view of what life was like in Maine and the nation in 1820, thanks to Dr. Ashley Rattner's perspective of the reformer and traveler Fanny Wright. Then we'll be hearing from Stephen Nissenbaum, who will be talking about the unexpected origins of American Christmas from the year roughly 1820. Then after a brief, then we'll take questions for both of them. After a brief intermission, we'll be hearing from our second morning panelists. We'll be hearing from James Francis Sr., Director of Cultural and Historic Preservation, the Penobscot Nation, about the Indigenous experience in Maine and what Maine statehood meant for Native peoples. And then Sharon Murphy of Providence College will be speaking to us about America's first great financial panic, the underappreciated Panic of 1819. I know it sounds very different from today. I was writing everything out to firm publicity and thinking, yes, dispossession of Native peoples, financial crashes, political tensions. This is all, the past is a foreign country. And so that will be our second morning panel. We'll have an intermission for lunch. Then our afternoon keynote will be Matthew Mason talking about Maine statehood in the context of increasing sectional tensions over the expansion or not of the institution of slavery. And then immediately following that keynote, we will have an all scholar roundtable in which I will be, it's always my favorite part, getting to ask the various participants to sort of reflect on what each other's presentations makes them think differently about their own work. And then we'll be taking questions from the audience and wrapping up a little before 3 p.m. today. And so if you're able to stay with us for the whole thing, we're glad. If you're able to stay with us for part of it, we're also glad of that too. So without further ado, I'm gonna get right into our first panel for this morning. And so our first speaker, I have the pleasure to introduce Dr. Ashley Rattner. She's an assistant professor of American literature at Tusculum University in the great state of Tennessee, specializing in 19th century print culture and reform. Her article, No Such Fairy Land, So Like the Real World, Miles Coverdale's Performance of the Utopian Spectacle, is forthcoming in the Nathaniel Hawthorne Review. Though she lives in Tennessee, she's a great and frequent tourist commentator and writer of all things New England. And so she was an amazing get for this talk today. And so Dr. Rattner is working on a book manuscript titled The Crass Materiality of Utopia, Publishing Communitarian Reform in 19th Century America. And she currently serves as a member of the 19th Century Podcast Subcommittee. Without further ado, Dr. Ashley Rattner.
Thank you, Ian. So my talk today is titled Fanny Wright's American Travels. I wanted to begin by just telling you who Fanny Wright is, if you're not already familiar. Frances Wright is a social reformer who was very well known in her day, partially famous, partially infamous, but this side of the 19th century, we don't really remember her as well outside of academic circles. So I want to talk a little bit about why that is and look at a travel narrative that she published in 1821 and just take a glimpse into the America she saw there and the uses that she builds into this publication. Wright is an early and outspoken advocate for the abolition of slavery, women's rights in education, birth control, workers' rights, freedom of the press, and a number of other free-thinking ideals. In the mid-1820s, she founded a utopian commune a couple miles outside of Memphis, Tennessee, through which she expected to emancipate the entire enslaved population of the United States. Spoiler, this didn't work. But after that, she kind of picks up the pieces, starts editing a couple of newspapers, does the lecture circuit. So she's just an incredibly versatile and active reformer at the center of a lot of these debates in the early 19th century. She's credited as one of the first women to lecture publicly to mixed audiences in the United States, and she toured extensively through the Lyceum circuit in the late 1820s and 1830s, often to packed lecture halls. As to why she is barely remembered today, I wanted to invoke Holly Jackson's recent book, American Radicals, which is excellent. I highly recommend it if you're interested in Fanny Wright or just reform more broadly. It's very readable and I highly recommend it. But Jackson points out that many 19th century radicals are either forgotten or seem less radical now because the things that they were teaching have become mainstream, right? Like if Wright is espousing ideals that no one has ever heard of before, it's going to be received much differently in 1820 than it is today. We're like, yes, I agree that women should be educated and things like that. So, and just kind of as a backdrop to know how to contextualize all of this, to situate Fanny Wright's travels within her own personal life. She was born in Dundee, Scotland in 1795. She was orphaned very young, and her biographers describe her as a serious and studious child. She has a younger sister, Camilla, who she's very close with throughout her life, and they're kind of passed around from relative to relative. So they're upper middle class, but she doesn't have the happiest or most stable childhood in a lot of ways. However, she does have access to a liberal education as a function of her class. Her father had been deeply influenced by the Scottish Enlightenment, and that kind of is just something I mentioned to indicate what kind of books are available to her in the library. The people that the family is friends with are certainly influencing her growing up, that she has these liberal ideas and reads voraciously and wants to learn more about democracy and things like that. As an adolescent, Wright grew enamored with the idea of America. This is probably an apocryphal story, but there is this anecdote about how, as like a teenager, she's sitting in her study reading, and she has, I believe it's like a history of Italy, and she sees mention of the founding of the United States, and her mind is blown by it, right? She's like, how have I not heard of this? This is everything that I care about and love actualized in a national experiment. Like, this can't be real. I would have heard of this already if America existed. So she throws the book, runs across the room to the Globe, and is like desperately trying to find corroboration that America is indeed an actual place. This would have been like the 18 teens probably. So in a lot of older histories, like, no, there's not necessarily reference to the founding of the United States. That was fairly recent, especially in the books that belonged to her father or the older histories that she would have had access to. But eventually she finds that, yes, this did indeed happen. And this idea kind of takes a hold of her, that she can't wait to be old enough to go and visit as soon as she can scrape together the money, and she reads more on it, and this becomes the consuming idea of her life, that a nation committed to liberty and equality is something that's worth devoting one's life to. And ultimately, in several different ways, that's what she does. I'm sorry, I'm scrolling through my notes in this new format. So to fast forward a little bit to 1818, 1819, and 1820. Wright and her little sister Camilla arrive in New York in 1818 and embark upon this 2-year-long trip just touring the United States. Fanny had the more dominant personality. Physically, she was very tall and classically beautiful, confident, well-spoken, inquisitive, and from accounts of people who knew her or heard her speak, she really just like, as she entered a room, she commanded the attention of everyone in there. While Camilla was more reserved yet deeply loyal to Fanny. So a lot of the travels that we're going to be talking about today are pretty much Fanny saying like, hey, I want to go to Monticello and meet Jefferson and things like that. And then Camilla, out of support for her, comes with her and accompanies her to all of these events and things of that nature. A staunch critic of organized religion, Wright pointed out that the church had been used to condone a host of societal evils, the most obvious example being slavery and the poor treatment of women. In the popular imagination, later in her life, she would be branded as an infidel, in the sense to mean non-Christian. With her critiques of marriage as, again, this institution that denies women legal rights to own property, to have the full rights that white men are able to have access to. She becomes known as the red harlot of infidelity in her later life. So there's a political cartoon of her as a goose, essentially. She's wearing a gown, she has a goose's head, and it says essentially that Fanny Wright is a goose that needs to be hissed. So how did we get here from like this innocent 20-something young woman just experiencing America for the first time to one of the most reviled women in America, who is championing all of these ways to make American more egalitarian or to more fully actualize the elements of the Declaration that she finds really compelling. To return to this early point, I think that this moment, the views of society and manners in America, is the foundational text by which we can see Fanny Wright's making a mythology of America. So by 1820, Fanny Wright is 25 years old. She hasn't edited any newspapers yet. She hasn't founded a commune or given these public lectures. But I'm looking at this moment as the origin point of her radicalization. What caused Fanny Wright to fall so deeply in love with America? What did she see in this deeply chaotic, uneven landscape that compelled her to devote her life to bringing about these ideals that she sees as the liberation of mankind? So, as Fanny and Camilla arrive in New York in 1818, I mentioned that they're kind of upper middle class, and just a quick way to convey what exactly that means in this context, they're well off, they're kind of known personalities, socialites nearly, but they don't really have like infinite resources to just continue to travel as much as maybe they would have liked. So Fanny authored a play about Swiss independence from Austria titled Aldorf, and it was produced in New York in early 1819. So it had a really like majestically well-received opening night and kind of fizzled a bit after that. But from the proceeds of this production, they were able to continue to fund those travels. So again, that they're in certainly extremely privileged circles. However, there is a limit to that, I think, is kind of in the backdrop the whole time. This too might not sound that dramatic to our contemporary ears, but the fact that Fanny and Camilla were traveling unaccompanied, and as two very young women, white, European, just kind of going as they pleased according to Fanny's whims, more or less. This was mildly scandalous. That, again, in society, women needed a male to just escort them into these circles, and what are the proper places of men and women in society. So the fact that they're on this trip at all is a controversial point that people are already talking about. And then the sorts of things that they're doing also don't fit into that kind of traditional narrative of a couple of 20-somethings are rambling around America. Almost sounds like a reality show. Instead of gravitating towards like social functions like balls or dances or just like ways to emerge as like a person of note, just more as a debutante than as somebody who's concerned with making the country a better place. Wright chose to spend her time meeting and conversing with figures such as the Marquis de Lafayette, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, again, that she is in the circles that allows her to have these kinds of political conversations. And in addition to that, she's also talking to the common people, just to get a sense of what America was like experientially. Her whole adolescence had been spent building up this idea of what America is in the abstract. But now that she's finally physically here, she wants to know everything about it. She's talking about the satchels that school children carry on their way to school, and how sailors spend their time. And just really, she's fascinated by every element of this. Wright is interested in unearthing a national character. And for us, looking at how she did that kind of sets the stage for the narratives, tensions, and dynamics that prove foundational to the host of reform movements that she would later become involved in. Again, what is the origin point? What is the story that she tells herself and also the world in order to justify, this is why this is something I care about. This is why we need to do these things I'm proposing. The narrative becomes central to anything that can come after that in the progressive trajectories that she is hoping to set into motion. So in 1821, Wright publishes Views in Society and Manners in America, both in New York and London. You'll see this later, but kind of the reception in those two spheres differ dramatically. Basically, what I'm going to do today is give you an overview of Views in Society of Manners in America, look at a few passages, and again, just really contextualize this in Wright's maturation as a reformer and what this portrait teaches us about the United States and New England in the 1820s. Brought a prop. Views is comprised of letters that Wright authored to her friends while touring America. For the most part, they're describing what she sees, what she's doing, who she's met, what they talked about. But there's a couple of mildly personal details that are like, oh, I visited this theater that you must remember, and things of that nature. Largely, they function as this society, this national character that she's trying to get to the heart of. As an upper class European white woman, Wright has the leisure to travel America out of pure curiosity. Again, it's kind of interesting to see how organic just those whims, or someone mentioned this place and let's go there next. How this is kind of unstructured, but that she has access to so many different kinds of worlds. I think another important thing to remember about the 1820s is that the way that publication worked, this is partially the effect of printing press technologies, transportation technologies, but the United States was not a unified entity by any means at that point. Life in Connecticut is very different than life in the South, or any number of communities, even within the same geographic region, could vary wildly. So I think at a time when there aren't national organs like newspapers, and coverage is spotty, and who can get the latest novels and things like that, that a bunch of pockets of people develop not fully independently of one another, but that they're clearly defined as distinct regional characteristics. So to just see so many of those as she moves around, you would need this kind of all expansive, rambling narrative in order to convey something of a national character, because it's not unified by something like, we could say, television or the internet would do to a certain extent today. The epistolary effect of this does make it feel intimate. Again, we kind of get a taste for Fanny's narration style, what makes her excited, what makes her angry. Overall, she's kind of enamored with everything that she sees. She's invested in both chronicling and interpreting the ramifications of all of these little like passing anecdotes of a conversation she had with someone on the street. She will both convey that that happened and then kind of muse about what its larger meanings are, right? Like, as many travel narratives do. Yes, this is primarily about my summer vacation, but this is what it means beyond that for the culture. Basically, she presents America as this new, progressive, enlightened space that, again, everything really excites her. The most banal things, like just, she can gush about them for pages and pages. And often to emphasize how great her experience is, she contrasts it with Europe, which is old and irredeemably stultifying. And again, everything that she's like, wow, this education system is really something to be admired. Unlike England, and she always has those little digs in there to show that how important this national experiment is in her estimation. I can read a passage from when she's on the ship over to illustrate what I mean by this. The ship is named Amity, which of course she makes a big deal of. I kind of feel like symbolism in 19th century ship names is like the low-hanging fruit of symbolism. Be like, oh, we were all together on a ship called Amity. But she really like leans into that and is like, I never witnessed even one quarrel, and you could tell that we were all living together. That's her sort of tone throughout this entire book. she establishes previously that most of the ship's crew is American, and says, quote, "It is worthy of remark that every member of the crew, from the old veteran to the young sailor boy, could read and write, and I believe, I might almost say every man, could converse with you on the history of his country, its laws, its present condition, and its future prospects." She depicts a lot of these individual conversations that she has with members of the crew, and is just really blown away by how well-spoken and educated they all seem. Again, how much national history do you have at this point in the early republic? Not very much. But again, this is indicative of the national character, that this isn't just, politics isn't just the domain of an elite ruling class, that any random person, you just pull aside a sailor who's knotting some rope over there, and everyone has these ideas of democracy and freedom, and they're well versed in that. That really impresses Wright with, again, the potential for what that could entail, both in the present and then mostly down the road. This also sounds kind of condescending, but I don't want to indicate that it is fully free of that. But I think in addition, it illustrates a willingness to learn from people unlike her. Again, that a woman of her class recognizes that she has a lot to learn from everyone. Everyone has something to offer, that she's not too good to speak to a member of the crew, that his experience is as valid as her own, and that if she wants to get to any sense of consensus about what this place is like, all of those perspectives need to be taken into account. This is much later, but it really reminds me of the passage in the preface to Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, when she says something along the lines of, "Go freely with powerful, uneducated persons, with the young and mothers of families." Again, figures that are not typically coded by members of society as wise people who have some wisdom to impart to you. I think that's just an example of her application of this democratic ideal. That, yeah, like, it's shaping her, things that she sees in the present, and then, of course, how she wants this to be used by her readers. I'm gonna skip ahead a little bit. She waxes poetic about Columbus kind of at length, but I want to just kind of touch upon, I don't know, I have time for this. America as an origin myth. I won't read the whole thing to you, but part of it is, she remarks, how much the human race is indebted to this great mind is still perhaps unknown. Of course, like, by looking at this, by looking at Columbus in this way, she is arguing that certain lives matter more than other ones, right? She's not acknowledging the Indigenous genocide. She is just very short-sighted in elements of this. That's very evident today. But still, that she's placing America on a global scale. That, again, this is not just one national politics, that beyond this, mankind can learn something, which, again, there's elements of exceptionalism here, but I think she's trying to use it to do good in her individual life. I wanted to conclude on Wright's depiction of New England. And she has some very nice things to say about New England. I'll start with this quote: "There's not a more truly virtuous community in the world than that found in the democracies of the East. The beauty of their villages, the neatness and cleanliness of their houses, the simplicity of their manners, sincerity of their religion, despoiled in great measure of its former Calvinistic austerity. Their domestic habits, pure morals, and well-administered laws must command the admiration and respect of every stranger. She then narrates that she's standing in the street and just kind of like enamored with how beautiful and healthy and cute all of the school children look as they're going to school, like the buckles on their shoes, their satchels. But the two main things that she admires about New England are public education and women's rights. Neither of these she depicts as like fully perfect yet, which again I think is more realistic than a lot of her observations in this travel narrative. But she says, the child of every citizen, male or female, white or black, is entitled by right to a plain education and funds sufficient to defray the expense of his instruction and raised either from public lands appropriated to the purpose or by taxes, sometimes imposed by the legislator and sometimes by different townships. So she goes into like how Connecticut funds its schools a little bit and then takes a step back and is just like, this proves how integral public education is to the American people, right? Like I can bore you with all of these like facts and figures, but this shows that the people of New England truly care about being an educated society. And it's remarkable that they're willing to do this. They're willing to pay in order to have this as an element of their culture. She's much more directly critical of the plight of women in New England. And she says that this is a fairly good place to be a woman in the grand scheme of the world. However, there's room for improvement, especially through education. She acknowledges the idea of Republican motherhood, that, well, they're only really educating women to be good mothers and to raise better citizens. But think about the possibilities if we went beyond that. Think about if we just gave women the same kind of education we give men. What would our populace look like if a full 50% of this collection of citizens were able to engage on that deeper level? She concludes with, had you studied with me the history and character of the American Republic, you see so many seeds of excellence, so bright a dawning of national glory, so fair a promise of a brilliant meridian day as your friend imagines that she can discern, you would share all that regret, impatience, and anxiety with which she regards every stain that rests upon her morals, every danger that threatens her peace. An awful responsibility has devolved on the American nation. The liberties of mankind are entrusted to their guardianship. The honor of freedom is identified with the honor of the Republic. The agents of tyranny are active in one hemisphere, and the children of liberty be equally active in the other. As you can imagine, Views was received very well in America, condemned roundly in England for just how unsympathetically they were shown in much everything. But while this travel narrative is largely humorous in how effusive Wright is in her awe of the young republic, Views operates as a comprehensive look at a host of facets of American society and character that are designed to elicit progressive change. In both Wright's personal life and for her readers, the narrative of her travel is calculated to cultivate both an appreciation of the unique opportunity that the American experiment affords to liberate mankind and to inspire individuals to operate within their communities in practical ways in order to ultimately achieve those ends. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much, Ashley.